sort of get to a blind crest and you go over that, and normally there's not a stationary car on the racing line when you're doing 120 mile an hour. This occasion there was. So I actually got into motorsport through my dad. So my dad was a bit of a petrol head when he was younger. Him and his mates started, racing at a very grassroots level, just for a bit of fun. And he actually bought me a go-kart, my first go-kart, when I was 2 years old, and I couldn't drive it until I was 6 or 7. So I mean, he was pretty keen, I think it's fair to say, for me to, get behind the wheel and give it a go. And that's kind of, where it all started. I was 6 or 7. I jumped behind the wheel of a go-kart. And initially my dad I was that slow, he used to run around the track in front of me, and he's not exactly an Olympian or a Mo Farah, so it kind of sums up where I started from, and then it just became something that I wanted to be doing, with every spare minute. At first it was something that, my dad would be working through the week, and he would, he wanted me to try it at first. So when I was about 6, we went to a track, tried it on a weekend, and that was kind of it. And then eventually, we went again, and I loved it even more. And then it just became something where every weekend I'd be, jumping up and down on the end of my dad's bed after he had a long week at work at 7 in the morning, saying, "Dad, can we go to the go-kart track?" So it was just one of those things where that hobby, that just something for us to do together, something that my dad had a passion for, eventually became my passion, and eventually became something that, all we knew was going away on weekends and competing and doing it together. Yeah, completely. It was something that, when I was at the sort of peak of my, by about 10 years old, when I was competing in British Championships at a go-kart level, I was away every single weekend throughout the year. The winter championships, summer championships, racing abroad in Italy. There's a lot of go-kart races in Italy, and a lot of the time I'd be, having Fridays off school. I have to take my homework with me and just catch up when I was away. That was always tricky and a bit of a challenge. My dad having to sit me down and get me to not focus on racing and to make sure I was keeping up my schoolwork. But those were the sacrifices that we made, because I didn't feel like sacrifices actually at the time, because I was just loving every minute of it. I think when I first started I was a very shy kid, and racing for me really grew my confidence in all areas of my life. I'd say when I was 10 and I won my first British Championship, that was where, that for me was a real statement moment, where it was like, this could be this is what I want to do with my future. This is where I see myself, being behind the wheel of a race car, for my entire life. That's what I want to do. So I'd say that was probably the defining moment for me, where I felt like, all those, those few years of hard work at that, that early stage from 6 to 10, and just growing in confidence and just, becoming, the driver that I was at that moment. It was where, I was looking at the likes of Lewis Hamilton, who had just come into Formula One. So I had, someone, a British driver at the top of the sport, and I was thinking, that's, that could be possible for me. So it was probably that year that unlocked those what if moments, that, why couldn't I be the next Lewis Hamilton? Why couldn't I make that my future? Yeah, I mean, so for me, my accident, it was any other race weekend. I prepared as usual on the grid. The race started. The conditions were the trickiest that, as a racing driver, you'll have to face, where you go out on the start of the race, you're on slick tyres, and then the rain comes. But interestingly for me, those were conditions that I actually loved to drive in. One, because I feel like it was a real separator, in terms of, the grid. Not many people, growing up in England, you're used to the rain, and my dad used to as well. When I first started, sometimes he'd make life a bit more difficult for me, and he'd send me out on slicks in the wet on purpose, because it's good for developing a feel for the car. So anyway, these conditions I absolutely loved. The first corner, there was an accident, not involving me, but that I had to go off track in order to avoid. So I came back on, I think I was second to last. So at that point, there's nothing really going on behind me. So it's full focus on, getting past the cars in front, making up ground. and that's what I was doing. The corner before I had my accident, I overtook a car for another position, so the progress was happening. And then a car had spun off on the racing line. My accident was at Donnington Park, where in a single-seater car, in a Formula 4 car, which is what I was driving at the time, it's very, you're really low to the ground, and it's slightly uphill, this section of the circuit. So you sort of get to a blind crest, and you go over that, and normally there's not a stationary car on the racing line when you're doing 120 mile an hour. This occasion there was, and the two cars in front of me that were battling ahead dived out of the way last minute as I was closing up to the back of them, and I was presented with this stationary car. The impact happened, everything came to a halt, and you've got so much adrenaline going through your body at that point that everything kind of came to a halt. I could hear the guy that I hit, the stationary car, he was screaming in the car, and the doctors come running over, and I say, don't worry about me, I'm fine. Go over to, I could hear him screaming, he's obviously in pain, and I'm getting ready to undo my belt buckles and jump out, because as a racing driver you've had crashes over the years. Like, you're not a racing driver if you haven't had a crash at some point. That's just the reality of the situation. Then obviously I started to settle into that moment and realise, okay, I'm not just able to jump out of the car here, there's more to it. You start looking at the doctors' faces, people around you, you really you can see that, that little glint in their eye, that element of fear where they're like, okay, this is a big crash, obviously. So I was awake for about 45 minutes in the car. My sister came up to the side of the car. They got her from the paddock where they were watching to come and sort of, basically hold my hand and, ease me through that moment as I started to, have that moment of panic myself. I was like, obviously this is a serious crash. Didn't know to what extent that would be. Didn't know if I'd, the doctors actually told my parents that at first they thought I'd broken both my legs. Then I get put into an induced coma, which was about 45 minutes after the accident. And I wake up 3 days later and I'm a double amputee. So that, for me, I had a long snooze. That's what it felt like. And I woke up and those surgeries had been taken out in order to save my life, and that was the reality of my situation. Well, yeah, when I first woke up, I was on that many drugs that I didn't really understand the situation still, Okay. I was awake. I think the first thing that my mum and dad always tell me, that I asked for a piece of paper when I was, just coming out of a coma, and I scribbled down in terrible handwriting on a piece of paper who won the race. Like, looking back on that, what a stupid thing to say. Why would you at all care about who won the race? But that was just apparently where my mind went. I'm not sure I believe them, but that's what they keep telling me. But yeah, a few days of, coming to terms with the situation and actually just being more present and understanding it properly. I was very lucky. My support network when I had my accident was phenomenal. So I was surrounded by my family, my friends, and naturally the hospital where I went to after my accident was only about 20 minutes away from the track. So a lot of my mechanics, engineers, people from around the motorsport community and in that paddock, they came and saw me when I was in hospital. And eventually, if you put enough people that love motorsport in a room together, even if someone's had a terrible accident, a few days ago, you're going to start talking about racing. That's just where the conversation went to. And then one of my mechanics mentioned Alex Zanardi, who was a racing driver, became a double amputee as a result of a crash, and he went back to driving again. So that sort of was the first moment where I thought, okay, well, maybe this, there is a possibility that I can go back and I can race again. At that stage, obviously, the focus was on, just getting healthy again and figuring out what life was going to look like. But I knew that, if there was a possibility that, I was open to that, being the case. And I ended up driving a car around a circuit 11 weeks after my accident. Not a proper racing car. This was a VW Beetle, so a little bit different to a Formula 4 car. But I did that in order to get my license back with hand controls. I remember the first few laps in particular felt horrible because, as an athlete, as a sportsman in any sport, when you are doing your sport, that's when you're at your most comfortable. And all of a sudden, I was thrown, from the age of 6 to 17, I drove, go-karts and cars a certain way. And now I was looking at a set of hand controls thinking, I don't know what I'm doing here, and this is what I the best at. So that moment was quite tricky at first. 5 laps in, started to get the hang of it. The confidence started to come back, and by the end of the day I was absolutely loving it, and realised that if it was possible to still be a racing driver and do that, that's what I wanted to do. It's interesting, you say it was a completely different me, but fundamentally I was the same 6-year-old boy that started go-karting and decided at the age of 10 that I want to do this for the rest of my life. So it was quite an interesting time for me, because everyone viewed me, like friends, family, they viewed me as a different person almost, because of the nature of this public accident I had and how it changed my life, and I become an amputee. But I was the same person, regardless of that fact. So my sort of recovery and getting back to racing, for me, it wasn't it was purely because that's what I love to do. That's what fueled that passion, that drive. And I think that's what allowed me to, get over my accident to a certain extent as well, and accept those circumstances. Was, sport gave me in that moment the ability to look forward and think, well, what have I still got control of, and what can I still do to make my dreams a reality? So it was small goals at first, and getting back driving was the fundamental main goal that was always, that was shaping the decisions I made after I had my accident. Rehabilitation, I'd go to, hospitals where, from the inside it looks horrible and you don't really want to be there. But I was thinking about, doing this to get back behind the wheel, and all of the sort of decisions I was making was with that at the forefront of my mind. So that was kind of my thought process, was that I'm the same person. I need to, I want to get back behind the wheel, so I need to, day-to-day life, need to make these decisions in order to find myself back, being behind the wheel in that place that I loved. And it was a long process. Like you say, it's 11 weeks after the accident. Being in a VW Beetle doesn't really cut the mustard when you compare that to, being in an F4 and F3 car doing 150 mile an hour, plus. And it didn't feel like, that light bulb moment. It was just lots of little things fell into place, and just slowly, bit by bit, I got closer to that goal. And eventually, 11 months after my accident, I was competing not only in racing again, but I was made a step up in terms of category to Formula 3. So when I had my accident, I was doing Formula 4, and a lot of people, when I told them that I wanted to go back to racing, sort of said, oh, you're going to go back and do F4 again. At the time, I had to change a couple of rules with the governing body, because it wasn't allowed that disabled drivers could compete in single-seaters against able-bodied drivers. So obviously that was one of the first small goals to make right. And then they asked me, well, what are you going to go back to driving Formula 4? And my sort of mental state of viewing myself in the same way said, well, if I hadn't had my accident, the plan that year was to win the British F4 Championship, and that would have led me to competing in British Formula 3. So why treat my situation, my skill set as a driver any differently? Just because I drive the car in a different way now doesn't mean that I'm not the same person who's put 11 years of my life into honing and perfecting my craft. So that was what led me to go back to racing, and to race in British Formula 3 11 months after my accident. Everyone asks me that question, and everyone kind of assumes that Donnington Park as a track holds this, there's that sort of doom and gloom over the place where it's like, oh, I'm back, where I had my accident. I love that circuit, and that might sound weird, considering it was such a dark moment, in my life. But it was just a case of my accident was wrong place at wrong time. It could have happened anywhere. Like this, it's not the circuit's fault, and I actually love that circuit because it's high speed, and it was just one of those circuits that brought the best out of me as a driver. And I love the fact that when I went back to Donnington, my first time back there, I managed to get the pole position. So out of the whole field, that was my first actual pole position after my accident, driving with hand controls, and it was at the circuit where it happened. So that was a nice cherry on top.